Every family has its secrets. It's a common phrase. But what happens when those secrets turn deadly? What happens when the cracks in the facade grew too large to hide? And the truth that's been buried for years comes to light in the most horrific way possible. This is the story of the Lisky family, whose seemingly ordinary life would end in bloodshed, horror, and tragedy. Martin, Ohio, a quiet rural town that most people would pass by without a second thought. It was a place where families spent their weekends enjoying the outdoors, tending to their gardens, and attending church on Sundays. It was a place where people knew each other, where you could walk down the street and wave to a neighbor, where everyone was connected by a sense of community and familiarity. But as peaceful as it appeared, the town would become the backdrop for a gruesome tragedy that would haunt its residents for years to come. The Lisky family lived in the outskirts of Martin on a sprawling 100-acre property. Their house was tucked away in the woods, far from the noise and distractions of the busy town center. On the surface, they seemed like just another family living the American dream, hardworking, family-oriented, and doing their best to make it all work. Billy Lisky, the patriarch of the family, had served in the Air Force, and after his service, he went to work at a waste management company. He was the kind of guy you could count on, always there with a joke or a laugh, the life of any party. He was a natural entertainer, and people gravitated toward him for his humor and positive energy. His wife, Susan Lisky, was equally committed to her family. A loving mother and devoted wife, Susan managed the family's household and worked as an office manager. She was an outdoors enthusiast who loved activities like hunting, fishing, and gardening. Her life was centered around her children, and she took great pride in nurturing them, instilling values and making their house feel like a home. Together, Billy and Susan had 3 children. Billy brought his son, BJ, into the marriage, and Susan brought her 2 sons, Derek and Devin Griffin, from her previous relationship with her ex-husband, Gary Griffin. BJ, who was Billy's only son, was the eldest, and the dynamic between him and his stepbrothers was strained from the start. Blending families is never easy, and the Lisky family was no exception. BJ, who was used to having his father's attention to himself, now had to share it with 2 other boys. And at a time when BJ was navigating his teenage years, this change was anything but smooth. Billy and Susan tried their best to make their new family work, but there were challenges along the way. Derek, the second oldest son, was more on the shy side, but he was involved in sports like track and field, and he was a second-degree black belt in Taekwondo, an impressive achievement. Devin, the youngest, had a love for swimming and diving and even sang in his church's choir. Despite their differences, the 3 boys learned to coexist, and the household settled into a routine. However, there was one person who didn't seem to be able to find his place in this new family dynamic: BJ. BJ was unhappy with his stepmother, Susan, from the very beginning. It's not uncommon for children to struggle with step-parents, and BJ's anger was directed mainly at her. He resented her presence in his father's life and, by extension, the changes she brought to the household. Susan, for her part, tried to be a loving and caring mother to him, but BJ resisted her attempts to parent him. The relationship between them grew increasingly strained, and their disagreements turned into physical altercations. The tension was palpable. This tension only escalated as time went on. Eventually, BJ was forced to leave the family home because of his violent outbursts toward Susan. His behavior became erratic, and at one point he even threatened to harm himself. Billy, torn between his loyalty to his son and his love for Susan, called the police to intervene. But BJ's aggression didn't stop there. He was arrested multiple times for fighting, assaulting his stepmother, and even attacking a police officer during one of his outbursts. His violent nature became more apparent, and despite attempts to get him the help he needed, it seemed like nothing would ever work. He was eventually placed in a group home, where he lived for a time, but even there his behavior didn't improve. Despite all of this, Billy didn't give up on his son. Billy loved BJ, and he believed in his potential. He filed for legal guardianship to keep BJ out of a psychiatric hospital, hoping that, with the right care, his son could turn his life around. Billy's hope for his son never wavered, even as BJ's mental health continued to deteriorate. But it was clear to those around him that BJ was spiraling further out of control. His bipolar disorder, schizoaffective disorder, and substance abuse made him a ticking time bomb. And those closest to him knew it. If you're intrigued by this case, make sure to hit that like button, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe for more details about this chilling case. You won't want to miss what happens next. In the fall of 2010, just weeks before the horrific events of Halloween, BJ came home for a hunting trip with his father. It was an opportunity for them to bond, to reconnect in a way that Billy had hoped would help BJ heal. For a brief moment, it seemed like their relationship was improving. The trip was pleasant, and BJ appeared in good spirits. But after the hunting trip, Billy decided to make an exception. Instead of returning BJ to the group home as planned, he allowed him to spend the night at the family home. This decision would prove to be fatal. At this point, you might be wondering, how could a family that seemed to be so full of love and hope for the future end up with a murder so horrific? What went wrong? Was it the years of unresolved tension, the breakdown of a father-son relationship, or something even darker? The events that were about to unfold would change everything. BJ had been on the outside looking in for years, but this night was different. Something inside him snapped. The frustrations, the anger, the bitterness he had been carrying for so long finally boiled over into something far more dangerous. It was Halloween 2010, and the Lisky family was about to be torn apart in the most unimaginable way. But how did this seemingly normal family, living in a peaceful town, end up at the center of a brutal triple homicide? This is a story of rage, broken relationships, and an unimaginable tragedy. A story that would forever haunt Martin, Ohio.
Halloween morning in Martin, Ohio was meant to be like any other. A crisp fall day, the air just cold enough to warrant a jacket, but still welcoming for trick-or-treaters to roam the streets. Children eagerly awaited the evening, ready to dress up in their favorite costumes, stock up on candy, and embrace the usual Halloween fun. Families decorated their homes with carved pumpkins, and the neighborhood buzzed with excitement for the night ahead. But for the Lisky family, Halloween 2010 would be far from normal. This wasn't a day of costumes or candy. No, this was the day that horror would seep into their peaceful rural life, shattering their sense of safety and security forever. It began with a seemingly ordinary morning. Devan Griffin, Susan's youngest son, had spent the night at his father's house. It was the weekend, which meant he had no school, and Halloween morning felt like a chance to relax. He was tired, having stayed up late, and his mind was occupied with the day's plans. But as he returned to the Lisky home that morning, he had no idea that his life was about to change forever. This case is far from over. What was the motive behind the brutal killings of Billy, Susan, and Derek? Was it a crime of passion or something far darker? Make sure to like this video, comment with your theories, and subscribe to stay tuned for the next part of this chilling investigation. You won't want to miss what happens next. Around 9 a.m., Devin returned to the house. He was in a hurry. He had to change for church. His mother, Susan, and stepfather, Billy, were still asleep in their bedroom, and he noticed that things were oddly quiet in the house. The silence felt unsettling, but Devin chalked it up to the early hour. He rushed into his room to change his clothes, not giving it much thought. He didn't hear any sounds coming from the kitchen, no voices or movement. His thoughts were elsewhere. What happened next would be the first sign that something was terribly wrong. Hours passed as Devin stayed in his room, likely preoccupied with video games or thinking about the upcoming church service. Time drifted by unnoticed until he received a phone call from his Aunt Lori, his mother's sister-in-law. The call was simple at first. Lori was trying to get a hold of the family, but no one was answering. Derek, Devin's older brother, was supposed to be at her house that day, working on a few things for her and her husband, but he never showed up. No one answered their phones, and Aunt Lori was growing concerned. She had tried to reach Susan, but that too had failed. It was strange. Where was everyone? At that moment, the reality of the situation hit Devin. It wasn't just his aunt who couldn't get in touch with anyone, it was him, too. The house, which was usually lively with conversation and activity, was eerily silent. Devin's instincts told him something was wrong. He decided to go check on his family. Maybe they were still asleep, maybe they were just busy, but nothing could have prepared him for what he was about to find. He walked into his parents' room, as he had many times before, but when he approached their bed, he noticed something odd. Both Billy and Susan were still lying there under the covers. At first, he thought they were just sleeping in, but as he called out to his mother, there was no response. He called her name again. Nothing. Devin's heart raced. This wasn't right. He walked over to his mother's side of the bed and tried to shake her awake. He called her name one more time, but there was still no response. The unease turned to fear as Devin slowly pulled back the blanket, expecting to see his mother, her face peaceful in sleep. What he saw next would haunt him forever. The blanket pulled away to reveal his mother's pillow covered in blood. The world around Devin seemed to collapse in on itself. His mind scrambled to make sense of it. Was this some sort of prank? Was this a Halloween gag? After all, his parents were known to be the type to enjoy elaborate pranks, especially on holidays. But no, this was no prank. Devin's world went into slow motion as he continued to pull the covers back, revealing more of the horror that lay beneath. His mother, Susan, and his stepfather, Billy, were lying in pools of their own blood. They were lifeless, still, their bodies cold to the touch. It was clear now. This wasn't a joke. It wasn't a Halloween trick. His mother and stepfather had been brutally murdered. But the horror didn't stop there. Devin, in a frantic state of shock and confusion, bolted out of the room and screamed for help. His mind was racing. What had happened? Who had done this? Devin immediately called his Aunt Lori again, still in disbelief. He didn't know what to say or how to make sense of what he had just seen. His aunt, also in shock, rushed to the house. She quickly called 911 and asked police to meet her at the Lisky residence. Meanwhile, Devin was left standing in the silence of his home, the gruesome reality of the situation setting in. The most terrifying realization of all, his brother, Derek, was still missing. Derek, who had been such a steady presence in the family, was nowhere to be found. Devin didn't know it yet, but he was about to make another horrifying discovery that would confirm his worst fears. When Aunt Lori arrived, the scene she walked into was nothing short of a nightmare. She found Devin standing at the door, shaken and in disbelief, unable to comprehend the full scope of what had happened. Aunt Lori, in shock herself, entered the home and quickly confirmed the grisly discovery. She could barely believe what her eyes were seeing. The police soon arrived, and the full scale of the tragedy began to unfold. The investigation team quickly realized the gravity of the situation. Billy Lisky had been shot 5 times in the face and head. Susan, too, had been shot in the head at close range. The methodical nature of the killings pointed to a deliberate and personal act of violence. But the more they searched, the more questions arose. There was no sign of forced entry into the house, no indication of a robbery, nothing that would suggest an outside person had been involved. The only conclusion they could draw was that the killer had been someone with access to the home. Someone the family knew. But who could it have been? And then, as the investigators continued their search, they made another chilling discovery. One of the bedroom doors was locked, and after breaking it down, they found yet another body. Derek. The discovery of Derek's body only deepened the mystery. Unlike his mother and stepfather, who had been shot, Derek was beaten to death with blunt force trauma. A bloody claw hammer was found nearby, but the weapon used to kill Billy and Susan was nowhere to be found. From the scene, it appeared that the killer had started with Derek, the oldest son. Derek, young and strong, might have been seen as the biggest threat. He was beaten into submission, possibly before he even had a chance to defend himself. Then the killer moved on to Billy and Susan. Billy was shot first, execution style, his face and head blasted 5 times at close range. Susan, it seems, was awakened by the gunshots, likely seeing her husband die in front of her. She tried to flee, but was shot and forced back into bed, dying alongside Billy. As investigators pieced together the timeline, they realized that Devin had been home during all of this, but had no idea. The horror that had unfolded while he was locked away in his room playing video games was unimaginable. But the question remained, who could have done this? Who had such deep, violent rage that they could commit such a senseless act against their own family?
As the investigation into the brutal Lisky family murders began to unfold, the horror of the crime scene only deepened. In a small, rural town like Martin, Ohio, a tragedy of this magnitude was unheard of. With no signs of forced entry and nothing stolen from the house, investigators were left with more questions than answers. The brutality of the killings suggested a personal motive, but who could have done such a thing to this seemingly loving family? The police immediately began their work, trying to piece together the timeline of events that led to this shocking crime. The first step was to establish the exact time of the murders. After all, Devin had been in the house all morning, but he had no idea what was happening just a few rooms away. According to the neighbors, they had heard gunshots early that morning, around 6:30 a.m. At first, no one thought much of it. In a rural area like this, gunshots were not an unusual sound. People hunt here. It was a familiar noise, and many simply assumed it was someone practicing their aim or going out for a hunt. But when investigators looked at the details, the gunshots made perfect sense. The murders, they deduced, must have occurred around that time. The killer, likely aware that no one else would think anything of it, had used a gun to execute Billy and Susan in their bed, likely while they were still sleeping. The neighbors, hearing the gunshots, didn't think to report them because they were so commonplace in the area. But now looking back, it was clear that the Liskys had been dead by the time Devin returned home. Devin had left for church early that morning, as he did most Sundays. He returned around 9:30 a.m. to find his family already gone, already murdered. By that time, the killer had already moved on to other things, and Devin had unknowingly spent hours in the house with his family's dead bodies. It's hard to imagine what must have been going through his mind when he made that fateful discovery. But for investigators, the most chilling realization was that the killer had done this all before Devin returned home. The killer had been in the house, in close proximity to Devin, without him ever knowing it. The killer could have killed him too, but didn't. So who was the killer? At first, Devin was understandably questioned by the police. He had been in the house that morning, and he had found bodies. His behavior, though, didn't raise any red flags. The police ruled him out as a suspect quickly, confirming that he was not involved in the crime. His alibi was solid, and there was no indication that he had anything to do with the murders. This led the investigators down a new path. Who else had access to the house? Who else could have been there, someone who knew the family well enough to get in without raising suspicion? The answer seemed obvious. It had to be someone close to the Liskys, someone who had lived in that house, someone who had been there recently, someone who had a motive. And there, on the list of suspects, was BJ, Billy's son from a previous marriage. BJ was the only other family member with known access to the house. At the time of the murders, BJ was staying with his father Billy at the family cabin for a hunting trip. The trip had gone well, and BJ had seemed to be in good spirits. But something had clearly shifted. On the morning of the murders, BJ was back at the Lisky home. It was an unusual move. He hadn't spent the night at the house since he was a teenager. But this Halloween, his father had allowed him to stay the night after the hunting trip, perhaps thinking it was a way to reconnect, a way to give BJ a sense of stability or just some time together. It was a decision that would have dire consequences. BJ's return to the Lisky home raised immediate suspicions. Investigators began to dig into his history, hoping to find any clues that might explain what happened. What they found was disturbing. BJ had a long history of violent behavior and mental health issues. He had been diagnosed with schizoaffective disorder and bipolar disorder, and his struggles with mental illness had plagued him for years. BJ's history was riddled with arrests, violent outbursts, and troubling incidents that only deepened the concern of those around him. The relationship between BJ and his stepmother, Susan, was fraught with conflict. From the very beginning, BJ had been unhappy with his new stepmother. He resented her for coming into his life and taking the place of his mother. Over the years, their relationship deteriorated. BJ became increasingly violent towards Susan, and it wasn't just verbal fights. There were physical altercations as well. Billy had tried to intervene, but the violence continued. In fact, there were several instances where BJ attacked his stepmother. At one point, he punched her in the chest during a heated argument. Another time, he struck her with a coffee mug and stole her car. On top of that, there were multiple instances where BJ threatened to harm himself and others, and he had even been arrested for attacking a police officer. Billy had reached a breaking point. He couldn't let this continue. Eventually, Billy made the difficult decision to kick BJ out of the home. BJ was placed in a group home, but even there, his behavior didn't improve. He continued to struggle with his mental health, and things got worse when he was caught starting fights with other residents. But Billy didn't give up on his son. He continued to support BJ even after all of the violence and trouble he caused. In fact, Billy filed for legal guardianship of BJ, hoping to get him the help he so desperately needed. He was convinced that with the right treatment, BJ could turn his life around. Unfortunately, BJ's mental health continued to decline, and by 2010, the family's hopes of reconciliation seemed impossible. BJ's anger, bitterness, and frustration grew, and those emotions culminated in the most tragic way imaginable. It was clear to investigators that BJ had a motive. His violent history, his anger towards his stepmother, and his recent return to the family home all pointed to him. The question now was, had BJ killed his family? And if so, why? As investigators continued to search for answers, they uncovered even more disturbing evidence that seemed to point directly to BJ. Devin had mentioned that BJ was in an unusually good mood the morning of the murders. This was odd because BJ was typically known for being moody, gloomy, and unpredictable. The fact that he was in good spirits that morning raised suspicions. Was he hiding something? Was he because he had already carried out his plan? The biggest clue came when the police learned that BJ had been at the house earlier that morning. Devin recalled seeing BJ packing things into his father's truck, a truck that was now missing. The truck was later found at the family cabin with BJ sitting outside, covered in blood, a lit cigarette in his mouth, and a sandwich sitting uneaten. The gun used to kill Billy and Susan was found in the truck, and the blood on BJ's clothes confirmed what investigators had feared. He was the killer. Do you think BJ's mental illness played a role in the murder of his family, or was there something more sinister at play? Leave your thoughts in the comments, hit the like button, and subscribe to follow the investigation as we uncover the shocking details of this case in the next episode. Don't miss it. BJ was arrested and taken into custody, and the investigation into his motives continued. What had driven him to commit such a brutal, senseless act? What made him snap?
As the investigation into the Lisky family massacre deepened, all eyes were firmly focused on one person, BJ Lisky. The son of Billy Lisky, BJ had been the last person to see his family alive, and his strange behavior the morning of the murders only raised more questions. Could BJ, the troubled and violent son, have finally snapped? Was his mental illness the driving force behind this brutal act, or was something more sinister at play? In the days following his arrest, investigators worked tirelessly to piece together the events of that fateful Halloween morning. What had led BJ to murder his father, stepmother, and stepbrother in cold blood? Was it the years of unresolved tension, the mental health issues he struggled with, or was it something darker within him that had remained hidden for so long? To understand why BJ did what he did, we need to take a closer look at his history, the troubled past that seemed to follow him everywhere. BJ's mental health issues were well known to his family.
Diagnosed with schizoaffective disorder and bipolar disorder, he had struggled for years with his anger, violence, and emotional instability. His relationship with his father, Billy, was strained, and his relationship with his stepmother, Susan, was even worse. From the moment Susan entered BJ's life, it was clear that he didn't like her. He resented the fact that she had taken his mother's place and was now the woman in his father's life. This resentment, mixed with his personal struggles, led to violent outbursts, often directed at Susan. In one particularly disturbing incident, BJ punched Susan in the chest during an argument. The violence didn't stop there. BJ also struck Susan with a coffee mug during another altercation, and he even stole her car at one point. These violent tendencies weren't limited to just Susan. BJ had a history of violent behavior toward others. He was arrested for assaulting police officers during an altercation, and his anger seemed to be directed at anyone who crossed him. His mental health issues compounded the problem. Despite the numerous incidents of violence and his escalating behavior, Billy never gave up on his son. Billy continued to support BJ, even when everyone else around him was concerned for his safety and well-being. Billy tried everything he could to help BJ. He filed for legal guardianship in an attempt to keep his son out of a psychiatric hospital. He believed that with the right care, BJ could turn his life around. But unfortunately, BJ's behavior only worsened. He would go through periods where he would stop taking his medication, which made his mental health deteriorate further. When BJ felt good, he thought he no longer needed his medication, not realizing that the very medication that helped him feel normal was the same medication that kept him from spiraling into violent episodes. The tension between BJ and his family grew worse over the years. After several years of trouble, Billy made the difficult decision to kick BJ out of the house when he was 18. The violence had become too much to handle, and Billy had no other choice but to send his son to a group home. But even there, BJ's problems didn't end. He continued to cause trouble, even fighting with other residents, and his behavior remained erratic. Despite this, Billy still tried to reconnect with BJ. In the fall of 2010, Billy invited BJ to join him for a hunting trip at the family cabin. For a brief moment, things seemed to be going well. The two spent time together, bonding over their shared love of the outdoors. BJ was even in good spirits, something that surprised those around him. Devin, Billy's stepson, noticed the change in BJ's demeanor. BJ was asking questions about where Devin was going, how long he would be gone, and when he would return. Devin found this strange. BJ wasn't known to ask about his whereabouts, much less be so friendly. In hindsight, it seemed that BJ may have been trying to keep tabs on Devin. The investigators later discovered that BJ had been in the house before Devin returned home. In fact, BJ had likely been there during the early morning hours when the murders took place. Devin was unaware of the danger lurking just a few rooms away as he went about his morning routine, getting ready to change for church. By the time Devin found the bodies of his family members, BJ was already gone, but the evidence against him was mounting. Investigators began to connect the dots between BJ's actions and the murder scene. His fingerprints were found on the truck, and his blood-soaked clothes left little room for doubt. The gun used to kill Billy and Susan was found in his father's truck, and BJ's movements on that fateful morning painted a clear picture of what had happened. The more investigators learned about BJ's behavior, the more they realized how carefully he had planned the murders. The choice to kill his family was not a spur-of-the-moment decision. It was the result of years of tension, anger, and unresolved emotions. BJ had lived in the shadows of his father's love for years, struggling with his mental health and battling his own inner demons. But that morning, something inside him snapped. Maybe it was the years of resentment towards Susan, the feeling that he was always the outcast in the family. Maybe it was the way Billy had continued to try to help him, despite his violent behavior. But whatever the reason, BJ made the decision to kill his family. BJ had the opportunity to kill Devin, too. When Devin returned home that morning, BJ could have taken advantage of the situation, but he didn't. Why? Perhaps it was because Devin had been the one person who wasn't a threat to him, the one person who didn't seem to be involved in the family's dysfunction. Or maybe BJ just didn't see him as part of the problem. Whatever the reason, Devin lived, but the trauma of discovering his family's bodies would remain with him forever. Once BJ was arrested, he was charged with the brutal murders of Billy, Susan, and Derek. His defense team tried to argue that he was not guilty by reason of insanity. BJ's mental health struggles were well documented, and his defense attempted to use his diagnoses as a way to explain his violent behavior. But in the end, BJ pled guilty to 3 counts of aggravated murder, hoping to avoid the death penalty. He claimed that he was not in his right mind when he committed the murders, and he even went so far as to blame Satan for his actions. BJ was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, but his story didn't end there. In 2015, 5 years after the murders, BJ was found dead in his prison cell from a self-inflicted wound. What do you think led BJ to commit this horrific crime? Was it his mental illness, or was there something deeper at play? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and if you haven't already, hit that like button and subscribe for more chilling true crime stories. Stay tuned for the final chapter of this heartbreaking case. To this day, the reasons behind BJ's actions remain unclear. What drove him to murder the people who had loved him, who had tried to help him, and who had given him every opportunity to succeed? The brutal killings of Billy, Susan, and Derek left behind a family shattered by loss and grief, and for Devin, the only surviving member, the pain of losing his family would never fully heal.
The brutal murders of Billy, Susan, and Derek Lisky left a hole in the hearts of those who knew and loved them. The violence, the shock, and the sheer senselessness of it all left the small town of Martin, Ohio, reeling. But as the investigation concluded and B.J. Lisky was brought to justice, the real toll of the tragedy became even clearer. What had caused B.J. to turn against his family in such a horrific way? What could have been done to prevent it? And how could a family that had once been so close end up in such destruction? For Devin Griffin, the surviving member of the Lisky family, the journey from the horror of that fateful morning to the years that followed was one of unimaginable pain. At just 16 years old, Devin found himself at the center of a tragedy that no one, especially a teenager, should ever have to experience. He had not only lost his family in the most violent and traumatic way possible, but he also had to process the overwhelming emotions of grief, anger, and confusion. The hardest part for Devin wasn't just the brutal discovery of his mother, stepfather, and older brother's bodies. It was the realization that the person who had killed them was someone he had loved, someone who had once been part of his family. BJ was his stepbrother, the person who had lived in the same house, who had shared memories with him, and who, despite their differences, was still family. But that bond had been broken in the most horrific way. In interviews after the murders, Devin spoke about how difficult it was to process the loss of his family. He had never been particularly close to Derek, his older brother, but the bond that had existed between them, the shared memories of growing up together, was now gone forever. And the loss of his mother and stepfather was something that no amount of time or therapy could erase. The trauma of finding his family dead, of knowing that the killer was someone so close to him, would haunt him for the rest of his life. As the years passed, Devin continued to cope with the loss in his own way. He married his high school sweetheart, someone who had been by his side throughout his ordeal, and they started a family together. In a touching moment of tribute to his late brother, Devin named his son Derek after his older brother, preserving the memory of a life that was taken far too soon. But even as Devin moved forward with his life, the scars of that day never fully healed. He was forever marked by the events of Halloween 2010. There would be no going back to the life he had once known, no way to erase the trauma he had experienced. And while he continued to live, to love, and to grow, the memory of his family would always be with him. B.J. Lisky, meanwhile, faced the legal consequences of his actions. After being arrested, he was charged with 3 counts of aggravated murder for the deaths of Billy, Susan, and Derek. His defense team argued that he should be found not guilty by reason of insanity due to his mental health issues, which included schizoaffective disorder and bipolar disorder. BJ had a documented history of violence, and his defense attorneys claimed that these mental health issues played a major role in his actions. They painted a picture of a man who had been unable to control his rage and who had acted out of a mental breakdown. But even with these arguments, the evidence against BJ was overwhelming. He had been found covered in blood, with the gun used to kill his father and stepmother in his truck. His fingerprints around the truck and his strange behavior leading up to and after the murders further confirmed his involvement. In the end, BJ pled guilty to all charges, avoiding the death penalty in exchange for a life sentence without the possibility of parole. For the Lisky family and the people of Martin, it was a bittersweet resolution. While they would never have the answers to all of their questions, why BJ killed his family, why he snapped, why he chose this path, they could at least find some semblance of closure in the fact that BJ would never be able to hurt anyone again. However, the story didn't end there. In 2015, just 5 years after the murders, BJ Lisky was found dead in his prison cell from a self-inflicted wound. His death marked the end of the saga for many, but it raised even more questions. Was this the result of a man who had simply been unable to cope with the guilt of what he had done? Was it a final escape from the trauma of his own actions? Or was it a symptom of the mental illness that had plagued him throughout his life? The truth will never be known. For the Lisky family, the aftermath of this tragedy was far from over. Billy, Susan, and Derek were gone, and Devin was left to pick up the pieces of his shattered life. He had survived, but at what cost? The emotional toll of losing 3 family members in such a violent way would stay with him forever. But Devin, in his strength, refused to be consumed by the darkness. He chose to live on, to find joy in his family, and to honor the memory of the loved ones he had lost. There is no easy way to sum up a tragedy like this. There are no words that can truly express the pain and heartbreak that a family goes through after such a violent loss. And there are no easy answers to the questions surrounding BJ's actions. But what is clear is that the Lisky family story is one of love, loss, and resilience. Devin's courage in the face of such unimaginable pain is nothing short of inspiring. He found a way to rebuild his life, even as the memories of that terrible day stayed with him. For Billy and Susan, their story was tragically cut short. They were parents who had loved and cared for their children, who had given everything they had to create a stable, loving home. For Derek, his life was tragically taken before he had a chance to fulfill his potential. And for BJ, the violence that plagued him throughout his life would be the ultimate tragedy, one that claimed not only his family, but his own life as well. This case has left so many unanswered questions and so much heartbreak. What do you think was the true motive behind BJ's actions? How could this family tragedy have been prevented? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Please make sure to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share it with others to help spread awareness. Thank you for joining us in uncovering the untold stories behind the headlines. This is the story of the Lisky family, a family forever scarred by violence and loss, but also one that shows the strength of the human spirit, the power of love, and the unbreakable bond of family.